The year was 2547 and humanity had finally found peace among the stars. 17 colonies spread across the Outer Rim territories, each one a testament to mankind's desire for a simpler life away from the crowded cities of Earth. These weren't military outposts or industrial complexes, but farming settlements and mining communities where families could raise their children under alien sunsets and teach them the value of hard work. The colonies had been established over the past 50 years, each one carefully chosen for its Earth-like conditions and abundant natural resources. New Haven was the crown jewel among them, a world of rolling green hills and clear blue oceans where 10,000 souls had made their home. Captain Jake Morrison guided his transport vessel through the shipping lanes between colonies with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The Wanderer was nothing special, just a mid-sized cargo hauler that ferried supplies, equipment, and occasionally passengers between the scattered human settlements. Jake had spent 20 years in the military, flying fighters and commanding patrol cruisers, but he had walked away from all of that 3 years ago. The nightmares from the unification wars had finally stopped, and he had found something resembling contentment in the quiet rhythm of civilian life. His co-pilot Lisa Brennan sat in the seat beside him, running through their approach vectors to New Haven while humming an old Earth song that Jake couldn't quite place. Below decks, engineer Danny Cruz was performing his daily inspection of the ship's fusion drive, muttering to himself about a coolant valve that kept reading 0.3 degrees higher than regulation. The ship's medic Karen Wright was in the galley preparing lunch for the crew, the smell of something that might have been chicken stir-fry wafting through the corridors. They were a small crew, but they worked well together, and Jake had come to think of them as family. Real family was waiting on New Haven, though. His younger brother Peter had moved there 5 years ago with his wife Claire and their 2 kids, building a life as a farmer on the edge of the colony's main settlement. Jake tried to visit whenever his shipping routes brought him to New Haven, and today was one of those days. The Galactic Council had promised protection to all member species, and humanity had joined that interstellar coalition with hopes of peaceful coexistence. The Council consisted of 12 spacefaring civilizations, each bringing their own culture and technology to the grand experiment of galactic cooperation. Ambassador Helen Price represented humanity in the Council chambers on the neutral world of Axis Prime, and by all accounts she was doing a fine job of maintaining Earth's reputation as a peaceful and reasonable species. The Council had strict rules about military buildup and aggressive expansion, rules that humanity followed to the letter. The colonies had minimal defensive capabilities because the Council's charter guaranteed their safety, and besides, who would want to attack a bunch of farmers and miners? War Chief Thexus of the Zalkari Dominion had a different perspective on things. He stood on the bridge of his flagship, studying the holographic display that showed the human colonies scattered across their little patch of space. The Zalkari were a reptilian species, tall and scaled with eyes that could track movement in near darkness, and claws that could rip through steel. They had built their empire through calculated aggression, conquering 7 lesser species over the past 2 centuries, and absorbing their territory into the ever-growing dominion. Thexus had personally led 40 campaigns and never suffered a defeat. He viewed the galaxy through the lens of predator and prey, and right now humanity looked very much like prey. The intelligence reports his scouts had gathered painted a picture of a weak and defenseless species. The human colonies had no orbital defense platforms, no fighter squadrons, no ground-based weapon emplacements. Their settlements were protected by nothing more than local security forces armed with small arms and riot equipment. The humans seemed content to farm their land and mine their asteroids, showing no interest in military power or territorial expansion. Thexus found this behavior both puzzling and contemptible. In his experience, species that refused to defend themselves deserved whatever fate befell them. The Dominion needed new territory and resources, and these soft humans had both in abundance. Ambassador Quellis of the Vryn Hive had tried to warn Helen Price during their last meeting in the Council chambers. The insectoid diplomat's compound eyes had reflected genuine concern as he explained that the Zalkari were positioning their fleets near human space and making aggressive statements in diplomatic channels. Quellis had seen this pattern before, back when the Dominion destroyed the Pelthian civilization 15 years ago. Helen had thanked him for his concern but maintained that humanity's peaceful policies would protect them. She believed that showing no aggression would give the Zalkari no reason to attack, and besides, the Galactic Council would intervene if any member species was threatened. Quellis had left that meeting with a heavy heart, knowing that the humans were making a fatal mistake, but unable to force them to see the danger. On New Haven, Peter Morrison was helping his daughter fix a broken fence post on the edge of their property. The girl was 7 years old and insisted on holding the post steady while her father mixed the concrete. Her face scrunched up in concentration as she tried to keep it perfectly vertical. Peter's son, just 5 years old, was supposed to be helping, but had gotten distracted by a blue butterfly and was now chasing it through the tall grass. Claire called out from the house that lunch would be ready in 10 minutes, and Peter found himself thinking about how lucky he was. He had left Earth behind with no regrets, trading the crowded urban sprawl for clean air and open spaces. His brother Jake would be arriving later today, and Peter was looking forward to showing him the new irrigation system he had installed in the North Field. The colony was preparing for its 10th anniversary celebration, a week-long festival that would feature competitions, concerts, and enough food to feed twice the population. Banners hung from buildings in the main settlement, and the children were practicing a play they would perform on the opening night. Mary Phillips, one of the colony's teachers, had written the play herself, a story about the first colonists and the challenges they had overcome to build New Haven into a thriving community. Nobody was thinking about war or danger or the fact that they were completely defenseless. Why would they? The galaxy was at peace, the Council protected its members, and humanity had no enemies. Jake Morrison brought the Wanderer into New Haven's orbital traffic pattern and requested landing clearance from the colony's small control tower. Lisa was already shutting down non-essential systems for their landing approach, while Danny secured the cargo bay. Karen had finished lunch and was bringing plates up to the bridge, the smell making Jake's stomach growl. They would land at the colony's spaceport, spend the night at Peter's farm, and leave tomorrow morning with a cargo of grain bound for the mining colony on Riverside. It was a routine trip, the kind they had made dozens of times before, and Jake was already looking forward to seeing his niece and nephew. War Chief Thexus gave the order, and 40 Zalkari warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of 3 separate human colony systems. New Haven, Greenfield, and Riverside all appeared on his tactical display, highlighted in red as primary targets. His weapons officers reported ready status across the fleet, plasma cannons charged and kinetic bombardment systems armed. Thexus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This would be quick and decisive, a demonstration to the galaxy that the Zalkari Dominion took what it wanted and crushed anyone too weak to defend themselves. The humans had no fleet in position to respond, no defenses that could threaten his ships. It would be like stepping on insects. Peter Morrison looked up at the evening sky as the first stars became visible. His daughter was beside him, pointing out the constellations he had taught her, making up stories about the patterns they formed. Claire and his son were inside cleaning up after dinner. Jake's ship would be landing soon, and Peter wanted to be at the spaceport to meet him. Something caught his eye then, a bright flash of light that was too steady to be a meteor and too bright to be a satellite. Another flash appeared, and then another. Peter felt a cold weight settle in his stomach as understanding dawned. Those weren't stars. They were ships. The communication device on his belt crackled to life with the colony administrator's voice, tight with barely controlled panic, ordering everyone to seek shelter immediately. The bombardment began 3 seconds later. Jake Morrison's blood turned to ice as the Wanderer's sensor array lit up with hostile contacts. 40 ships had just appeared in orbit around New Haven, their weapon signatures painting them clearly as Zalkari warships. Lisa was already pulling up their communication system, trying to reach the colony's control tower. Danny burst onto the bridge asking what was happening, but Jake couldn't form words. His brother was down there. His family was down there. The first plasma impacts hit the planet's surface, bright flowers of destruction visible even from orbit. The colony's few defense satellites were firing, but they were nothing compared to the Zalkari fleet. The Zalkari fleet moved with mechanical precision as they bombarded the 3 human colonies. War Chief Thexus watched the tactical display with cold satisfaction as plasma fire rained down on New Haven, Greenfield, and Riverside. The weapons were designed for maximum destruction, superheating the atmosphere and creating shock waves that leveled buildings for miles around each impact point. Population centers were hit first, then the spaceports, then the power generation facilities. The few defense satellites the colonies possessed fired their pathetic laser arrays at the Zalkari shields and accomplished nothing before being vaporized by return fire. Within the first 10 minutes, 70,000 human civilians were dead, and the number was climbing with every passing second. Jake Morrison pushed the Wanderer through New Haven's atmosphere at speeds that made the hull groan, and the temperature gauges scream warnings. Lisa had stopped trying to talk him out of this suicide run, and was instead diverting all available power to the forward shields. Danny was in engineering performing miracles to keep the fusion drive from overloading, while Karen strapped herself into a crash seat and prayed to gods she wasn't sure she believed in. The colony below them was burning. Massive craters marked where schools and hospitals and homes had stood just minutes before. The main settlement was a sea of fire, and secondary explosions rippled through the industrial district as fuel tanks and chemical storage facilities cooked off. Jake's hands were shaking on the controls, but his voice was steady as he called out to Peter on every frequency he could access. There was no answer. There would never be an answer. The Zalkari bombardment continued for 6 hours. It wasn't just military efficiency, it was deliberate extermination. Thexus had ordered his fleet to leave no structure standing, no infrastructure intact, no hope of survival for those on the surface. His weapons officers targeted evacuation ships as they tried to flee, turning them into expanding clouds of debris and frozen bodies. Civilian transports, medical shuttles, even small personal craft were all fair game. The war chief wanted to send a message to the galaxy that the Zalkari Dominion took what it wanted and destroyed anyone who stood in their way. The fact that these particular targets weren't standing in anyone's way seemed irrelevant to him. Weakness deserved punishment, and humanity had proven themselves weak. Jake managed to land the Wanderer at the edge of what used to be a farming community 20 miles from the main settlement. The ship's sensors were picking up faint life signs scattered across the area, people who had somehow survived the initial bombardment by taking shelter in basements or storm cellars or pure blind luck. Lisa was already suiting up in an emergency pressure suit because the atmosphere was thick with smoke and toxic particulates. Danny grabbed a medical kit that was woefully inadequate for what they were about to face. Karen was crying but moving with professional efficiency, loading emergency supplies onto an anti-gravity sled. They had maybe an hour before the Zalkari noticed them and decided one more target didn't matter. The scene outside the ship was hell made real. Bodies lay everywhere, some intact, others not. All of them people who had been living peaceful lives just hours before. Buildings had collapsed into rubble and fires burned with chemical intensity, where plasma had superheated soil into glass. Jake found the first survivor underneath a collapsed wall, a man in his 60s who had been pinned there for hours. They pulled him free and loaded him onto the sled. Then they found 3 more, then a dozen, then 20. Lisa discovered a school basement where 17 children had taken shelter with 2 teachers. The teachers were dead, killed when the building collapsed. But they had thrown themselves over the children and their bodies had created just enough space for the kids to breathe. Mary Phillips was one of those teachers, barely alive but conscious enough to whisper that the children needed help before she passed out. They worked through the fires and destruction for 3 hours, pulling survivors from the wreckage. Karen did triage with tears streaming down her face, marking some people for immediate treatment and others as beyond help. Danny used his engineering skills to shore up unstable structures and cut through collapsed beams. Lisa coordinated their search pattern, using the Wanderer's sensors to locate life signs. Jake moved like a machine, refusing to think about what he was seeing, refusing to acknowledge that his brother's farm was in the direction of the largest crater. They pulled 43 people from the ruins, 43 out of 10,000. The mathematics of genocide were brutal and simple. The Zalkari fleet departed after 6 hours, their weapons depleted, and their mission accomplished. 3 human colonies had been reduced to smoking ruins. Orbital stations were debris fields. The few ships that had attempted to evacuate were scattered wreckage. Thexus transmitted his battle report to the Dominion's High Command and received immediate approval for his actions.
He had demonstrated Zalkari superiority and acquired 3 new systems for colonization.
The fact that some humans might have survived was irrelevant. They had no military, no fleet, no way to retaliate. The war chief ordered his fleet to return to Zalkari space and began planning. His next campaign against another weak species on the Dominion's border, Jake Morrison sat in the Wanderer's cockpit with his head in his hands while Lisa handled the calculations for their jump to the nearest safe port. The survivors were crammed into the cargo hold, many of them injured, all of them traumatized. Karen was doing what she could with limited medical supplies. Danny had discovered something disturbing in the sensor logs from the attack. The Zalkari hadn't just bombarded the colonies. They had been scanning them during the entire engagement. Detailed scans of population density, infrastructure, defensive capabilities. They were gathering intelligence, treating this massacre as some kind of test. Jake forced himself to stand up and contact Earth Command. The response came back after 10 minutes, and it was everything he feared. Acknowledge receipt of distress signals. Transport survivors to medical facilities. Await further instructions. Bureaucratic nonsense while his brother's body was somewhere in the ashes below. On Earth, the news hit like a physical blow. President Catherine Webb received the initial reports in her office overlooking Lake Geneva. 3 colonies attacked. Estimated casualties in the tens of thousands. No warning, no demands, no communication whatsoever. Just sudden and overwhelming violence against civilians who had no way to defend themselves. Catherine was 70 years old and had spent her entire political career working toward peaceful coexistence with alien species. She had believed that humanity's best path forward was cooperation and mutual understanding. Now she was reading casualty lists that kept growing every time they were updated. Children, families, people who had trusted that the Galactic Council would protect them. The Unity Council convened an emergency session within 2 hours. Representatives from every Earth nation and major colony gathered in the council chamber, their faces reflecting shock and rage in equal measure. Some demanded immediate military response. Others urged caution and diplomacy. A few suggested appealing to the Galactic Council for intervention and justice. Catherine listened to them all with growing certainty about what needed to happen. Admiral Richard Hayes sat in the back of the chamber in his dress uniform, his weathered face expressionless. He had commanded Earth's defense fleet for 12 years, and during that time his forces had done nothing more exciting than piracy suppression and search and rescue operations. The fleet existed as a deterrent, a remnant of humanity's more violent past that most people preferred to forget about. The debate went on for 3 hours. Ambassador Helen Price connected via hologram from Axis Prime and reported that the Galactic Council was preparing to issue a strongly worded condemnation of the Zalkari actions. Strongly worded. Catherine felt something cold settle in her chest. 70,000 people were dead, and the Council's response was going to be words. Helen suggested sending a diplomatic envoy to the Zalkari Dominion to negotiate reparations and ensure this never happened again. The chamber erupted in shouting. Richard Hayes stood up and his voice cut through the chaos like a knife. He said there was no negotiating with genocide and no diplomacy with monsters who murdered children. He said the defense fleet could be mobilized within 48 hours, and that humanity had the capacity to respond with overwhelming force. The question was whether the Council had the will to authorize it. Catherine Webb looked around the chamber at the representatives who held humanity's future in their hands. She thought about the colonists who had believed they were safe. She thought about the parents who had watched their children die. She thought about the message that would be sent to the galaxy if humanity did nothing. Then she thought about the message that would be sent if they did something. Her voice was steady when she called for a vote. Authorization for full military mobilization and offensive operations against the Zalkari Dominion. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. 38 in favor, 7 opposed, 3 abstaining. Richard Hayes saluted and left the chamber immediately. He had work to do. The shipyards of Mars had not seen this level of activity in 80 years. Olympus Basin stretched across 200 square miles of the red planet's surface, a massive complex of construction berths and assembly facilities that had built humanity's war fleet during the Unification Wars. Most of those ships had been mothballed after the wars ended, placed in preservation status and tucked away in storage orbits where they wouldn't remind people of humanity's violent past. Now those same ships were being brought back to life. Commander Alan Foster stood on the bridge of the battleship Vengeance and watched his crew work with frantic efficiency to bring the massive warship back to operational status. The Vengeance was 2 miles long and massed 40 million tons, a dreadnought-class vessel designed for one purpose: to destroy other warships. Chief Engineer Stephanie Cole was working miracles in the engine rooms. The fusion reactors had been in cold storage for decades, and bringing them online was like waking a sleeping giant. Every system needed to be checked, tested, and rechecked. The graviton cannons required calibration. The plasma lance batteries needed new focusing crystals. The point defense grid had to be synchronized. Stephanie had a crew of 300 engineers, and they were all working 18-hour shifts. She refused to let this ship launch with anything less than perfect readiness, because once they entered combat, there would be no second chances. The Vengeance carried enough firepower to level a city from orbit, and Stephanie intended to make sure every weapon functioned exactly as designed. On Luna, Captain Nicole Gardner walked through the hangar bay of the carrier Defiant and tried not to show how overwhelmed she felt. The Defiant had been her dream assignment when she graduated from the academy 20 years ago, but she had never actually expected to command it in combat. The carrier was enormous, capable of launching 200 fighter drones simultaneously and carrying enough antimatter missiles to crack a planet's crust. Nicole had handpicked her senior officers from the best the fleet had to offer. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper was her tactical officer, a brilliant strategist who could see patterns in chaos. Lieutenant Amy Ross handled weapon systems and had a reputation for making impossible shots. Together, they would turn the Defiant into the most dangerous ship in human space. The truth that most civilians didn't know was that humanity had never really stopped preparing for war. After achieving faster-than-light travel and discovering they weren't alone in the galaxy, Earth's governments had made a collective decision. They would present themselves as peaceful and cooperative to alien species, but they would maintain the capacity for overwhelming violence if that peace was ever threatened. The defense fleet that patrolled human space was just the visible portion of Earth's military power. The real strength was hidden in reserve fleets, concealed weapons platforms, and classified research programs that had continued running, even during the decades of peace. The Galactic Council had strict regulations about military build-ups, but humanity had found creative ways to comply with the letter of those laws while ignoring their Spirit.Earth's orbital defense network was activating layers that nobody outside the military command structure knew existed. What appeared to be communications satellites were actually weapons platforms, armed with railguns capable of firing projectiles at a significant fraction of light speed. What looked like cargo transfer stations were missile batteries containing thousands of warheads. The asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter had been seeded with automated fortress stations during humanity's paranoid phase after first contact. Those stations had been quietly maintained and upgraded over the years, waiting for a day that most people hoped would never come. Admiral Richard Hayes watched the defense grid come online and felt a grim satisfaction. If the Zalkari or anyone else wanted to threaten Earth, they would have to come through a wall of fire that would make their attack on the colonies look like a minor skirmish. The Galactic Council was in chaos. Ambassador Quellis sent urgent messages to every member species warning that humanity was violating multiple treaties with their military mobilization. The Council had very specific rules about fleet sizes, weapons development, and aggressive military posturing. Humanity appeared to be breaking all of them simultaneously. Emergency sessions were called. Diplomatic notes were sent. Threats of sanctions were issued. Ambassador Helen Price received all of these communications and forwarded them to President Catherine Webb with a note asking for guidance on how to respond. Catherine's reply was brief and devastating. The Council had failed to protect human civilians from genocide, therefore humanity no longer recognized the Council's authority in matters of defense. Any species that wished to remain on friendly terms with Earth was welcome to do so, but humanity would not be bound by treaties that offered no real protection. The message sent shockwaves through the galactic community. Several species that had relied on the Council for their own security began to question whether those protections meant anything. If the Council couldn't or wouldn't stop the Zalkari from massacring 70,000 humans, then what good was the Council? Some species began quietly reaching out to Earth through back channels, asking about mutual defense agreements. Others increased their own military spending. The careful balance of power that the Galactic Council had maintained for centuries was starting to crack. Quellis tried to explain that humanity's response was disproportionate, that diplomacy and sanctions would eventually bring the Zalkari to justice. Nobody was listening anymore. The time for diplomacy had passed when the first plasma bolt hit New Haven. Jake Morrison and the crew of the Wanderer completed their military retrofit and received orders to report to Rally Point Aurora. The ship now carried enhanced sensor arrays that could detect enemy vessels at extreme range, electronic warfare systems for disrupting enemy communications, and a modest weapons loadout consisting of missile tubes and laser batteries. Lisa had spent 2 days learning the new systems and complaining that their peaceful cargo hauler had been turned into a barely adequate warship. Danny was more positive about the upgrades, particularly enjoying the improved power distribution system and reinforced hull plating. Karen had converted part of the cargo bay into a proper medical facility because she knew they would need it. Jake said very little during the preparation. His mind was somewhere else, probably back on New Haven, probably thinking about his brother. Rally Point Aurora was a set of coordinates in deep space beyond Pluto where the fleet was assembling. The Wanderer dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and Jake Morrison stared at the display showing what humanity had built in secret. 200 warships hung in formation, everything from nimble destroyers to massive battleships and fleet carriers. The Vengeance was there, its hull painted in flat gray that seemed to absorb light. The Defiant floated nearby, its hangar bays already launching patrol drones. Cruisers, frigates, support ships, and dozens of other vessels Jake couldn't even identify. This wasn't a defense fleet. This was an invasion force. Lisa whispered that she had no idea humanity had this kind of military power. Nobody did. That was the point. Admiral Richard Hayes stood on the bridge of his flagship, the supercarrier Dragon's Fury, and surveyed his assembled fleet. The Dragon's Fury was the largest warship humanity had ever constructed, a mobile fortress that served as both carrier and battleship. Its main weapon was a spinal-mounted antimatter cannon that ran the length of the ship, capable of destroying anything it hit with a single shot. Richard had commanded various ships for 30 years, but this was the first time he would lead them into actual combat. The weight of that responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders. He was about to order 200 ships and 50,000 personnel into a war that would either establish humanity as a power to be respected or end with their complete destruction. The Admiral activated the fleet-wide communication system, and his image appeared on every bridge, in every ready room, on every display screen across 200 ships. He spoke clearly and without emotion. They were not going to war for territory or resources. They were going for justice. 70,000 civilians had been murdered by an enemy that believed humanity was weak and defenseless. The Zalkari Dominion had made a fatal mistake. They had attacked peaceful farmers and miners, people who wanted nothing more than to live quiet lives under alien stars. Those people deserved protection and they deserved justice. The defense fleet was going to provide both. Richard told his crews that the galaxy was watching, and that humanity's response would define their place among the stars for generations to come. They would show the Zalkari and every other species what happened when you attacked humans. They would show them that humanity's peace was not weakness but choice, and that choice could be revoked. The speech lasted 10 minutes, and when it ended, there was silence across the fleet. Then one by one, ship captains began reporting ready status. Commander Alan Foster signaled that the Vengeance was ready for combat operations. Captain Nicole Gardner confirmed the Defiant's fighter wings were armed and prepared. Every destroyer, cruiser, and support vessel checked in. The human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Cathros Prime system, and every sensor on every ship immediately began cataloging targets. Admiral Richard Hayes stood on the bridge of the Dragon's Fury and watched the tactical display populate with hostile contacts. 90 Zalkari warships were gathered in defensive formation around their forward operating base, exactly where intelligence had predicted they would be. War Chief Thexus had received word of the approaching human fleet and gathered every available ship to meet the threat. He stood on his flagship's bridge surrounded by his senior officers and felt confident, despite being outnumbered 2-1. The Zalkari had conquered 7 species and fought in dozens of campaigns. These humans were amateurs playing at war. The fact that they had more ships meant nothing if they didn't know how to use them. Richard Hayes had no intention of making this a fair fight. He activated the fleet communication channel and gave orders that would define humanity's first major space battle in over a century. The main battle group would approach head-on at maximum combat speed, forcing the Zalkari to commit their forces to meet the frontal assault. Meanwhile, carrier groups led by Captain Nicole Gardner would use the system's orbital plane to flank from above and below. The enemy would see the obvious threat and miss the real danger until it was too late. It was a simple strategy called hammer and anvil, and it had worked for human commanders since ancient times. The fact that they were now using it in space with ships that could destroy planets didn't change the fundamental principle: fix the enemy in place and hit them from an unexpected direction. The Zalkari fleet moved to engage the approaching human ships. Thexus ordered his heavy cruisers forward while keeping his battleships in reserve. His tactical officers reported that the human formation was standard and predictable, a simple frontal approach that showed no imagination or tactical skill. The war chief smiled his reptilian smile and prepared to teach these upstart mammals a lesson about real warfare. His weapons officers charged plasma cannons and prepared kinetic bombardment systems. The range closed to 200,000 kilometers, then 100,000. The Zalkari opened fire first, sending waves of plasma bolts and railgun projectiles toward the human vanguard. Commander Alan Foster watched the enemy fire on his tactical display and gave a single order to his weapons crew. The battleship Vengeance's graviton cannons fired for the first time in 80 years. The weapons created localized gravity fields that crushed matter like an invisible fist. 3 Zalkari heavy cruisers suddenly found their hulls compressing inward as gravitational forces exceeded their structural integrity. Armor plating crumpled like paper. Internal bulkheads collapsed. Fusion reactors imploded. The 3 ships were reduced to twisted metal in less than 10 seconds. Chief Engineer Stephanie Cole monitored her readouts and confirmed that all weapon systems were performing exactly as designed. The plasma lance batteries fired next. Super-hot streams of contained plasma that burned through Zalkari shields and vaporized hull armor. The Vengeance was engaging 6 enemy ships simultaneously and destroying them one by one with methodical efficiency. Thexus stared at his tactical display in disbelief as his fleet began taking catastrophic losses. The human weapons were far more powerful than intelligence reports had indicated. His shields were collapsing under fire that should have been absorbed easily. His heavy armor was being penetrated by weapons that shouldn't exist. He ordered his battleships forward and commanded his fleet to concentrate fire on the human flagship. If they could destroy the Dragon's Fury, then the rest of the human fleet might break and run. It was a desperate gambit, but the war chief was starting to realize he had made a terrible mistake. These humans weren't peaceful farmers. They were killers who had been hiding their true nature. Captain Nicole Gardner's carrier group emerged from their flanking maneuver at the perfect moment. The Defiant and 4 other carriers launched their fighter drones in coordinated waves. 200 small craft poured from each carrier, a swarm of automated killers that moved with inhuman precision. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper coordinated the attack patterns from his tactical station, while Lieutenant Amy Ross armed the carrier's quantum torpedoes. The torpedoes were experimental weapons that humanity had developed in secret, missiles that could phase through shields and detonate inside enemy hulls. The Defiant fired 6 torpedoes and 6 Zalkari ships exploded from internal detonations that ripped them apart from the inside. The fighter drones swarmed over the remaining enemy vessels, overwhelming their point defense systems and landing thousands of precise strikes on critical systems. The battle became a slaughter. The Zalkari fleet tried to retreat, but human ships were faster, and their weapons had longer range. Richard Hayes gave no orders for mercy or prisoner-taking. Every ship that had participated in the colony attacks would be destroyed. His crews carried out those orders with cold precision. Destroyers hunted down fleeing cruisers. Frigates finished off crippled battleships. The Wanderer darted through the chaos with Jake Morrison at the controls, using their enhanced sensors to identify high-value targets. Lisa fed targeting data to the fleet while Danny kept their engines running hot. Karen prepared her medical bay for casualties, but the human fleet was taking surprisingly little damage. The Zalkari weapons couldn't penetrate human shields, and their tactics couldn't match human coordination. Jake Morrison's display highlighted a massive warship at the center of the Zalkari formation. The Wanderer's computer identified it as Thexus's flagship, based on the command and control signals it was broadcasting. Jake transmitted the coordinates to the Dragon's Fury without hesitation. This was the ship that had given the order to destroy New Haven. This was the monster who had killed his brother. Admiral Richard Hayes received the targeting data and ordered his weapons crew to prepare the main gun. The Dragon's Fury's antimatter cannon began charging, drawing power from every available system. The weapon required 30 seconds to reach full charge, and during that time the flagship was vulnerable. Zalkari ships converged on the carrier, sensing an opportunity. Human destroyers moved to intercept, sacrificing themselves to protect their flagship. The antimatter cannon fired. A beam of pure annihilation crossed the distance between the Dragon's Fury and Thexus's flagship in less than a second. Matter met antimatter, and the resulting explosion could be seen from the outer planets of the system. The Zalkari flagship and everything within 10 kilometers simply ceased to exist, converted into energy by the most powerful weapon humanity had ever deployed. War Chief Thexus died without knowing what killed him. His senior staff died with him. His dreams of conquest died in that same instant. The remaining Zalkari fleet broke completely, individual ships trying desperately to escape. Most of them failed. Human ships ran them down and destroyed them with the same methodical efficiency they had shown throughout the battle. 4 hours after the battle began, it was over. 90 Zalkari warships had entered the fight. 3 survived by surrendering immediately when the battle began, their commanders having enough wisdom to recognize they were facing something beyond their capability to resist. Those 3 ships were taken into custody and their crews imprisoned. The human fleet had lost 2 destroyers and suffered damage to 18 other vessels. Total casualties were 600 personnel killed or wounded. The mathematical disparity in losses sent shockwaves through every species monitoring the battle. Humanity had just demonstrated military power that nobody had suspected they possessed. The peaceful farmers and miners had revealed themselves to be something far more dangerous. Admiral Richard Hayes stood on his bridge and looked at the tactical display showing the wreckage of the Zalkari fleet. He felt no satisfaction and no joy. 600 of his people were dead. 70,000 colonists were still dead. This battle had changed nothing except to prove that humanity could kill when necessary. He opened a communication channel on all galactic frequencies, broadcasting on every wavelength that every species in the galaxy would receive. What he said next would be recorded and studied for generations. He began reading names. Every single colonist who had died on New Haven, Greenfield, and Riverside. All 70,000 names spoken clearly and without emotion. It took 3 hours to read them all. When he finished, he delivered humanity's terms. The Zalkari Dominion would surrender unconditionally. They would pay reparations to the families of the dead. They would stand trial for war crimes. They had 48 hours to comply. The alternative was simple and brutal. If the Zalkari refused, then humanity would burn every Zalkari world to ash. The human fleet would systematically destroy every colony, every outpost, every ship until the species was extinct. Richard Hayes made this promise with absolute conviction. His voice carried no anger or hatred, just cold certainty. Humanity had shown restraint for decades, choosing peace over violence. The Zalkari had mistaken that choice for weakness. Now they would learn the truth. Human restraint was not weakness but mercy, and that mercy had been permanently revoked for any species that committed genocide against human civilians. The galaxy could accept these terms or test them. Richard strongly suggested acceptance. The Zalkari Dominion collapsed within 24 hours of their surrender. The subject species that the Zalkari had conquered over 2 centuries saw their oppressors defeated and humiliated by humanity. Rebellions erupted on a dozen worlds. Zalkari colonial governors were overthrown, and in some cases executed by populations that had suffered under their rule for generations. The Dominion's military fractured into competing factions as individual commanders seized ships and resources for themselves. What had been a unified empire became a collection of warlord territories almost overnight. The speed of the collapse surprised even human intelligence analysts who had predicted it would take weeks or months. Fear was a powerful motivator, and the Zalkari had built their entire society on making other species afraid. Now they were the ones who were afraid. President Catherine Webb established a war crimes tribunal on the neutral station of Meridian 7, far from both human and Zalkari space. She insisted that justice rather than revenge would define humanity's response to the massacres. The tribunal would be conducted according to established interstellar law, with proper procedures and the right to defense. Some human citizens protested this decision, arguing that the Zalkari deserved no mercy after what they had done to the colonies. Catherine addressed these concerns in a public broadcast that was transmitted across human space. She said that humanity's strength came not from their weapons but from their principles. If they abandoned those principles in pursuit of vengeance, then they would become no better than the monsters they were fighting. The 70,000 dead deserved justice, and justice required proper legal proceedings. Admiral Richard Hayes was promoted to Fleet Marshal and given supreme authority over all human military forces. The fleet did not demobilize after the battle. Instead, it established patrol routes throughout human space and began offering protection to the former Zalkari subject species. Many of these civilizations were technologically primitive and had suffered terribly under Dominion rule. They looked at humanity with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. The humans had saved them from oppression, but had also demonstrated the capacity for overwhelming violence. Richard understood their concern and made sure his forces conducted themselves with professionalism and restraint. The goal was not to replace one empire with another, but to ensure that genocide would never again be tolerated in this region of space. Captain Nicole Gardner led an expedition to establish Sentinel-1, humanity's first true military outpost beyond their traditional borders. The massive starbase was constructed in orbit around a strategic location that allowed rapid response to threats in multiple directions. The station mounted enough firepower to hold off a fleet and served as a logistics hub for human patrols. Nicole personally oversaw the construction, working with engineering teams to ensure every system met her exacting standards. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper established the Tactical Operations Center, while Lieutenant Amy Ross set up the weapons grid. The station became operational 6 months after the battle and immediately began coordinating defense operations across a volume of space larger than the entire Zalkari Dominion had controlled at its height. Commander Alan Foster took command of the Second Fleet, a force of 40 warships tasked with hunting down the Zalkari warlords who refused to surrender. Some former Dominion commanders had fled to the frontier with their ships and crews, setting themselves up as pirates or trying to carve out personal territories. Alan's orders were clear: offer them one chance to surrender peacefully, and if they refused, then destroy them completely. The battleship Vengeance became infamous among the scattered Zalkari forces. Stories spread about the human warship that appeared without warning and gave warlords 60 seconds to make their choice. Most surrendered. Those who didn't were eliminated with the same brutal efficiency that had destroyed the main Zalkari fleet. Within a year, organized Zalkari military resistance had ceased to exist. Jake Morrison returned to New Haven with construction crews and supplies to rebuild the colony. The planet was still scarred from the bombardment. Massive craters where population centers had stood and fields of glass where plasma fire had superheated the soil. The work of rebuilding would take years, but Jake was determined to see it through. Lisa Brennan became the coordinator for supply logistics, managing the flow of materials and equipment to the colony. Danny Cruz led engineering teams that cleared debris and established new infrastructure. Karen Wright set up medical facilities for the construction workers and the few colonists who were returning to reclaim their homes. The Wanderer made regular trips between New Haven and other human worlds, ferrying people and cargo in support of the reconstruction effort. Peter Morrison's body was found in the ruins of his farm 3 months after the attack. He had died in the basement of his house, killed when the structure collapsed during the bombardment. Jake buried his brother on a hill overlooking where the farm had been, with a simple marker that listed his name and the names of his wife Claire and their 2 children. Claire and the kids had survived by reaching a public shelter in time, but Claire had died 6 months later from radiation exposure she received during the attack. Jake adopted his niece and nephew, becoming the only family they had left. He taught them about their father's courage and their mother's strength. He made sure they understood that their parents had died because of evil, but that good people had fought back and would continue fighting to prevent such evil from happening again. Mary Phillips recovered from her injuries and established a school in the rebuilt colony. She was one of the teachers who had sheltered children during the attack, throwing herself over them when the building collapsed. Her body had protected 3 kids who survived because of her sacrifice. When she was well enough to walk again, she insisted on returning to New Haven to continue teaching. Her first class consisted of 20 students, some of whom had lost parents in the attack. Mary's first lesson covered the history of what the students were already calling the Dragon War. She taught them about the peaceful years before the attack, the horror of the bombardment, and the justice that followed. She emphasized that strength without compassion led to tyranny, but compassion without strength led to victimhood. Humanity had learned to balance both, and that balance would define their future among the stars. President Catherine. Webb addressed the citizens of Earth and all 17 colonies in a speech that historians would study for generations. She spoke about the cost of peace and the price of weakness. The human colonies had trusted in the protection of the Galactic Council and in the goodness of alien species. That trust had been betrayed by the Council's inaction and shattered by the Zalkari's violence. 70,000 people had paid for humanity's naivety with their lives. The colonies would be rebuilt stronger than before, protected by a fleet that would never again allow such tragedy. Catherine announced increased military spending, expanded patrol routes, and new defensive installations on every human world. Some criticized these measures as too aggressive, but most citizens supported them. The memory of burning colonies was too fresh and the fear of future attacks too real. Humanity had learned its lesson, and the cost of that education had been written in blood and ash. The Galactic Council fragmented over the following year. Several species withdrew from the organization after humanity's departure, no longer believing that the Council could provide meaningful protection. Others remained but demanded reforms that the Council's leadership refused to implement. Ambassador Helen Price watched from Earth as the institution she had once served fell apart. She felt no satisfaction in being proven right about the Council's weakness. Some of the younger species formed a new coalition led by humanity, requesting mutual defense agreements and trade partnerships. Catherine Webb accepted these overtures carefully, making sure that humanity's new relationships were based on respect rather than dominance. The goal was not to build an empire, but to create a network of allies who would stand together against aggression. Admiral Richard Hayes stood on the Bridge of the Dragons, Fury 1 year after the Battle of Kethros Prime, and reviewed the current tactical situation. 40 warships patrolled human space at any given time, with 100 more in reserve ready to deploy within hours. New colonies were being established with proper defensive installations from the start. The defense fleet had expanded to 500 ships, and recruitment centers had waiting lists that stretched for years. Young people who had watched the colonies burn wanted to serve, wanted to make sure their families would never face such horror. Richard approved of their dedication, but made sure every recruit understood what military service really meant. It wasn't glory or adventure, but hard work and sacrifice and the willingness to use violence when necessary to protect the innocent. And Aide approached the Admiral with a question that had been asked many times in recent months. Would the galaxy test humanity again? Would some other species see the destruction of the Zalkari as a challenge rather than a warning? Richard considered the question carefully before answering.